Late one night, as a heavy rainstorm rattled the windows of my quiet suburban home, my phone buzzed sharply on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up in the dim light, showing an unknown number I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it might be a wrong number or perhaps a telemarketer calling at an odd hour. The hum of the storm outside mingled with the dripping of water from the eaves, creating an eerie soundtrack that set my nerves on edge. I hesitated, staring at the phone, debating whether to answer, but curiosity won out. Tentatively, I swiped to pick up. "Hello." My voice sounded small in the empty house, swallowed by the storm's distant thunder. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds before a voice came through, distorted and low, warped by static. It was almost a whisper, but with an edge that sent a shiver down my spine. "Where are you right now?" the voice asked, slow and deliberate, like a question in a game I didn't want to play. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "Who is this?" I managed, trying to keep my tone steady, though my pulse quickened. The line crackled, the voice distorting further before it spoke again. "Just tell me, where are you?" I glanced around my living room. The soft glow of a single lamp cast long shadows on the walls, the storm outside casting intermittent flashes of lightning that illuminated the dark corners. My suburban home, usually a haven of peace, felt suddenly unfamiliar, like a fragile shell that could break at any moment. "I'm at home," I said cautiously, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Look, this must be a mistake. You've got the wrong number." There was a pause, and then the static shifted into a faint, chilling laugh, almost like a breath caught between words. "No mistake," the voice said, barely above a whisper. "I know where you are. I've watched." A cold knot twisted in my stomach. I wanted to hang up, slam the phone down, but my fingers were frozen. The words felt like a trap closing in, a threat hidden beneath the static. Trying to rationalize it, I told myself it was some kind of prank, a cruel joke played by a stranger. But the voice had sounded too deliberate, too knowing. It wasn't random, and the distorted tone made it impossible to tell if it was one person or something else entirely. The sense of unease began to creep in, slow and insidious. I ended the call abruptly and sat back, heart pounding, the room suddenly too quiet except for the relentless storm outside. I kept my phone close, eyes darting to the screen every few minutes, expecting it to ring again at any moment. The following night, as the house settled into darkness and the rain softened to a steady drizzle, my phone lit up again with the same unknown number. This time, I didn't answer. But the ringing, sharp and insistent, cut through the silence, a relentless reminder that whatever had reached out to me the night before was still there, lurking. The calls came sporadically over the next few days, always late at night, always from that same unknown number. Sometimes the phone rang for only a few seconds before going silent. Other times, when I dared to answer, all I could hear was heavy breathing, slow and ragged, or faint, almost inaudible whispers that sent a chill crawling up my spine. Each call left me more drained, more anxious. I started to notice little things around the house, shadows that seemed to linger too long, the creak of floorboards in empty rooms, the feeling that I was being watched even when the curtains were drawn tight. The storm outside had passed, but the tempest inside my mind only grew stronger. Friends began to notice my distracted mood. When I told Sarah about the calls during a coffee break, she frowned. "You have to block that number," she urged. "Or report it. This isn't just some prank anymore." I wanted to believe her, but part of me resisted. What if blocking the number made it worse? What if the calls stopped only to be replaced by something more dangerous? The unease tethered me in place, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. One night, after a day filled with a persistent sense of dread, my phone rang again. I answered without thinking, and the voice came through, clearer but still distorted, colder than before. "I'm inside." The words hit me like a blow. My eyes widened as I looked around the darkened house, every shadow suddenly a threat. I fumbled for the lights, heart hammering in my ears. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady beep of the call disconnecting. I called the police immediately, breathless and shaking, telling them everything, the calls, the voice, the fear that had settled over me like a shroud. The dispatcher was calm but firm, promising to send patrols and keep an eye on the area. But when the officers arrived, they found nothing unusual, no signs of forced entry or suspicious activity. They suggested it might be a prank caller, but their reassurances did little to comfort me. Despite the police presence that night, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more tangible. I began double-checking locks, moving through the house with a flashlight, listening for any sign of intrusion. Sleep became elusive, nightmares of shadowy figures and whispered threats invading my rest. In those long, sleepless hours, I realized how fragile the sense of safety really was. My home, once a sanctuary, was now a cage filled with unseen eyes and whispered threats. The storm outside had passed, but inside, the darkness was just beginning to deepen. The nights that followed blurred into a restless haze, each one punctuated by the shrill ring of my phone cutting through the darkness. The mysterious calls had not stopped, in fact, they grew more erratic, more unsettling. Sometimes the phone rang at odd hours, midnight, 3 a.m., even just before dawn, catching me off guard, hard hammering before I could even reach for it. Other times, the calls came silently, the screen lighting up but no sound on the other end. I would stare at the phone, breath held, waiting for anything, whispers, a voice, a click, but all I heard was silence. When I did answer, the line was usually filled with strange noises, the ragged breathing of someone struggling for air, faint, unintelligible whispers that seemed to swirl just beyond comprehension, or a distant sound like footsteps pacing slowly, deliberately. Once, I thought I heard the faint rustle of fabric, as if someone was moving clothing or adjusting something close to the microphone. Each time, my skin prickled, and dread pooled in my stomach. I started keeping my phone close, but I dreaded its every ring, unsure if I would find relief or more torment on the other end. I debated blocking the number, but each time I considered it, a voice in the back of my mind warned me that might make things worse. What if whoever it was saw the block as a challenge? What if they escalated their threats? The calls had already turned personal, mentioning things only someone who knew me, or was watching me, could know. They referenced my daily routines, my work schedule, even where I parked my car. It was as if the caller was inside my life, lurking just beyond my reach. One evening, during a rare dinner with friends, I tried to shrug off the creeping paranoia. But when my phone vibrated on the table, the room seemed to tilt. I glanced at the screen, it was the same unknown number. I silenced it quickly, hoping no one noticed, but the tension inside me was impossible to hide. Later, when I confided in Sarah, she grew alarmed. "You have to do something," she insisted. "This isn't just some prank anymore. You could be in real danger." I nodded, but fear tangled with uncertainty. I didn't want to admit how terrified I was. The idea that someone might be watching me, following me, or worse, inside my home, was almost too much to bear. But Sarah's words lingered, a call to action I couldn't ignore. Then came the night that shattered whatever fragile sense of control I had left. The phone rang, piercing the silence like a gunshot. I answered, voice trembling. The line was filled with static and then, slowly, the same distorted voice from before whispered, "I'm inside." Panic surged through me like electricity. I glanced around the room, heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. Every shadow seemed to grow darker, every corner deeper. I checked the doors and windows again, fingers fumbling over locks and bolts. Nothing was out of place, nothing broken or disturbed. But the voice had said it. "I'm inside." I called the police immediately, my voice shaking as I recounted the call and my growing fear. The dispatcher was reassuring but professional, promising officers would patrol the neighborhood. When they arrived, 2 officers moved through the house with flashlights, checking windows, doors, the backyard. They found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, no one hiding in the shadows. Their calm, methodical approach was meant to ease my nerves, but by the time they left, the cold knot in my stomach had only tightened. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak and groan of the old house set my nerves on edge. I kept my phone within reach, flashlight in hand, ready to face whatever might come. The sense of being watched was no longer a vague fear, it had become a tangible weight pressing down on me. In the days that followed, the calls continued, sometimes multiple times a night. The voice grew more taunting, more aggressive. One call came with a chilling message, "You can't hide. I'm always close." Another was filled with a low, menacing laughter that echoed in my ears long after I hung up. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. I found myself jumping at shadows, flinching at every unexpected sound. My friends urged me to take stronger action. "Get a new number," Sarah said. Change your locks. Install cameras. Don't let this person control you. But each suggestion felt like admitting defeat, like giving in to the fear that was consuming me. I tried blocking the number once, but the calls didn't stop. Instead, unknown numbers began to call, silent, empty calls that left me feeling more isolated. It was as if the caller had multiplied, surrounding me from every direction. The paranoia I fought to suppress bubbled to the surface. I stopped going out after dark, kept the curtains drawn tight, and double-checked every lock multiple times before bed. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk working, my phone rang again. The caller ID displayed the same unknown number. I swallowed hard and answered, bracing myself. "Why won't you answer me?" the voice hissed, sharp and accusing. My hands trembled. "What do you want?" I whispered. A pause, then a faint sound like something scraping across the floor, slow and deliberate. "You'll see soon enough." The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the silent phone, heart racing. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable. I noticed little things, doors slightly ajar when I was sure I'd closed them, objects moved just a fraction from where I left them, the faintest scent of something metallic in the air. I tried telling myself it was all in my head, but the evidence piled up, each incident chipping away at my sanity. One night, after a particularly terrifying call where the voice claimed to be inside the house, I felt trapped in my own home. Every room seemed a potential hiding place. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, locking the door and wedging a heavy chair beneath the handle. The phone rang, shrill and persistent. I ignored it, focusing on steadying my breath. After what felt like hours, the ringing stopped. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. But the sense of dread lingered, worse than before. The police visits became more frequent, but their reassurances did little. They scanned the house, found no evidence, and reminded me that without proof, there was little they could do. Their presence was a temporary balm, but once they left, the fear returned in full force. I realized I was living in a state of constant vigilance, my mind on edge, my body tense. The calls were no longer just a nuisance, they were a relentless invasion of my peace, a sinister reminder that someone, somewhere, was fixated on me. In the midst of this, I struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy. At work, I forced myself to focus, masking the exhaustion and anxiety beneath a thin veneer of composure. With friends, I laughed when I could, but always with one eye on the clock, waiting for the moment I could retreat to the supposed safety of home. But home was no longer safe. It was a prison built from fear and uncertainty, where every shadow could hide a threat, and every ring of the phone could herald a new nightmare. The caller's presence was a dark cloud hanging over me, an invisible stalker who had invaded the very fabric of my life. And through it all, the voice continued to whisper, to taunt, to remind me that I was not alone, and perhaps never had been. Desperate for a break from the suffocating fear that had taken root in my suburban home, I accepted an invitation from my close friend Emma to stay at her remote cabin nestled deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place far from the reach of the relentless calls and the creeping dread that had consumed my life. The idea of being surrounded by towering trees and endless quiet felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. I packed lightly, hoping that distance and isolation might finally offer some measure of peace. The drive was long and winding, the road narrowing as it snaked through dense forest. By the time I arrived, twilight was fading into night, and the sky was smeared with stars obscured here and there by drifting clouds. Emma greeted me warmly, a comforting presence against the backdrop of the dark woods. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and windows that looked out onto the dense forest beyond. For the first few hours, I allowed myself to breathe. The absence of city noise, the steady rhythm of crickets, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze were soothing. Emma and I settled by the fire, sipping tea and talking quietly. For a moment, it felt like the nightmare was miles away. But that night, as I lay in the narrow bed beneath a thick quilt, the silence pressed in too heavily. My phone sat on the bedside table, its screen dark and lifeless. I had hoped the calls would stop here, but as I drifted toward sleep, a sharp vibration startled me. The phone lit up with the same unknown number. My heart leapt, and I scrambled to silence it, hands trembling. I told myself it was just a cruel joke, maybe someone tracking my location despite the distance. But the calls didn't end. Over the next few days, the strange phone calls resumed with a haunting persistence. They were different here, sometimes accompanied by noises that couldn't be explained by the wind or wildlife. Late one evening, a slow tapping began at the cabin window. I froze, staring into the darkness, heart pounding. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it had started, but the lingering sense of intrusion stayed with me. Another night, as Emma and I sat quietly reading, I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I looked out the window but saw nothing but shadows and trees swaying in the moonlight. I tried to secure the cabin as best I could, locking doors and windows, checking for any gaps or signs of forced entry. But no matter what I did, the feeling of being watched remained. The calls sometimes came with faint voices in the background, whispering just beyond comprehension. The tapping on the windows continued sporadically, as if someone was testing the boundaries, daring me to look outside. Emma was supportive but skeptical. "It's the woods," she said one morning over breakfast. "Animals, branches, your imagination. You need to relax." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to convince myself that the strange noises and eerie calls were nothing more than coincidence or natural sounds amplified by fear. But deep inside, I knew I was caught in a trap between the unknown caller and an environment that no longer felt safe. One particularly chilling night, the phone rang just as a storm rolled in, thunder rumbling overhead. I answered, and the distorted voice whispered, "You can't run." Suddenly, a sharp tapping began at the cabin door, slow and persistent. I grabbed a flashlight, heart racing, and edged toward the door. The storm thundered outside, rain pelting the windows, but when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. The tapping stopped. Emma and I discussed the possibility of calling the police, but the cabin's remote location meant help would take time to arrive, time I wasn't sure I had. We agreed to install additional locks and set up some basic alarms, hoping to deter any intruder. Despite these efforts, the sense of intrusion only grew. The tapping and footsteps continued, sometimes accompanied by faint voices carried on the wind. The cabin, once a refuge, had become another stage for the relentless horror that followed me. I found myself pacing at night, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the shadows beyond the windows. Sleep became rare as exhaustion and fear warred within me. I tried to keep a journal, documenting each strange sound, each call, hoping to make sense of the chaos, but the entries grew increasingly erratic, filled with fragmented thoughts and rising panic. One evening, as I sat by the fire, the phone rang again. I answered, steeling myself for whatever awaited. The voice was closer this time, clearer but no less menacing. "You can't hide. I'm always near." I hung up, hands shaking. Emma tried to comfort me, but the truth was undeniable: we were trapped in a nightmare that no distance or isolation could escape. The cabin, surrounded by endless trees and silence, was meant to be a sanctuary. Instead, it became a cage where the unknown caller and the eerie environment conspired to shatter any hope of safety. In that remote place, the menace was no longer just a voice on the phone, it was a presence lurking just beyond the shadows, a constant reminder that some threats cannot be outrun. The night Greg arrived at the cabin, the air felt heavier, thick with tension that seemed to seep into the very walls. I hadn't expected anyone else, especially not him. He was an acquaintance from years ago, someone I hadn't seen since college, and certainly not someone I wanted to be with during this nightmare I was trapped in. Emma had invited him, hoping the presence of another person might bring some relief. But from the moment he stepped through the door, something felt off. Greg's eyes darted around nervously as if the shadows held secrets only he could see. He carried a worn duffel bag, which he set down with a thud by the fireplace. His hands trembled slightly, and his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You're not safe," he said without preamble, glancing at me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "I know who's been calling." I stared at him, disbelief and confusion swirling inside me. "What do you mean? Who?" He hesitated, then pulled out a small box from his bag. Inside were letters and strange symbols scrawled on yellowed pages, some stained with what looked like dried ink or something darker. "These are connected," he said, his voice barely audible. "The calls, the stalking, it's part of something bigger. I've been researching this for months." Emma crossed her arms, skeptical. "Researching what, exactly?" Greg glanced around, lowering his voice further. "A group. A cult. They've been obsessed with your family, your past. The calls are just the beginning. I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but Greg's haunted expression made me pause. He seemed genuinely terrified, as if carrying a burden too heavy to bear. Over the next few hours, he recounted fragmented stories, tales of obsession, revenge, and dark rituals linked to my family history that I'd never heard before. Each revelation chipped away at the fragile sense of reality I clung to. As the night deepened, Greg's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He muttered to himself, his eyes flickering with a mix of fear and determination. At one point, he claimed to be protecting us from something lurking just outside, a presence he refused to name. The cabin, once isolated and peaceful, now felt like a battleground. Suddenly, the power cut out, plunging us into darkness. Emma fumbled for candles while I fumbled with my phone, which had no signal. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the sound of the storm raging outside and our uneven breathing. Then, a figure darted past the window, too fast to be anything ordinary. We froze, hearts pounding in unison. Greg grabbed a flashlight and shone it outside, but the beam revealed only shifting shadows and swaying trees. The atmosphere shifted from uneasy to outright terrifying. Greg's fragmented confessions hinted at a twisted game of revenge and obsession, but the lines between reality and delusion blurred. His warnings felt both urgent and unhinged, leaving me unsure whether he was a savior or another threat. As the hours dragged on, the cabin became a crucible of fear and suspicion. Conversations turned to accusations, and every creak or whisper outside set us on edge. Greg's knowledge of the dark forces supposedly hunting me was unsettling, but his unpredictability made it impossible to trust him fully. At one point, he revealed a collection of symbols painted inside the cabin's wooden beams, which he said were meant to ward off evil. I hadn't noticed them before, but now they seemed sinister rather than protective, as if the house itself was caught in some ancient, malevolent ritual. The night stretched endlessly, each moment thick with dread. I realized that the danger wasn't just the unseen caller or the shadowy presence outside, it was the tangled web of secrets, betrayal, and obsession that Greg had dragged into the open. The person I had once trusted as a friend now seemed like a stranger, a harbinger of chaos. In the early hours of the morning, Greg's demeanor shifted again. He claimed the cult had infiltrated the house, that we were surrounded by enemies cloaked in familiar faces. His eyes wild, he insisted we prepare to defend ourselves, turning the cabin into a fortress of makeshift weapons and barricades. The crescendo of fear peaked when a shadow passed through the doorway, silent and swift. We all saw it, an indistinct figure just beyond the firelight, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The sight left us shaken, the line between nightmare and reality dissolving. By dawn, the cabin was a shattered refuge. The confrontation with Greg had stripped away any illusion of safety or trust. The horrors that had pursued me were no longer just voices on the phone or distant shadows, they were tangled in the very people around me, in the past I thought I'd left behind. As the first light filtered through the trees, I sat amidst the wreckage of the night's terror, grappling with a new, harsher truth. Sometimes the most dangerous threats come not from strangers in the dark, but from the twisted betrayals hidden within familiar faces. Greg's arrival had opened a door to a deeper, more complex fear, one that would haunt me long after the shadows receded. Back in the city, the familiar hum of traffic and the flicker of streetlights felt strangely distant, like I was moving through a world detached from the nightmare I'd just left behind. The ordeal at the cabin, the calls, the shadows, and Greg's unsettling revelations clung to me like a second skin. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I knew I couldn't simply bury what had happened and move on. There were pieces to put together, questions to answer, and a fragile sense of safety to rebuild. With the police's help, I began piecing together the fragmented puzzle. The investigation uncovered threads I hadn't imagined, connections between the caller's identity and my family's past, the cult Greg had mentioned, and the dark obsession that had latched onto me. It was chilling to realize how deep the roots of this nightmare ran, extending beyond a single stalker or isolated incident. The web was tangled, filled with shadows that reached into places I thought were private and secure. The police took the calls seriously, increasing patrols around my neighborhood and installing surveillance equipment near my home. They traced some of the phone signals, revealing they had been cleverly masked through multiple devices and locations, making it difficult to pinpoint the exact source. It felt like chasing ghosts, but the effort was a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this fight. Friends rallied around me, offering support that was both comforting and grounding. Sarah stayed by my side, helping me navigate the overwhelming flood of fear and uncertainty. Their presence reminded me that vigilance didn't mean isolation. Reaching out, sharing the burden, was a crucial step toward reclaiming my life. Through the ordeal, I learned harsh lessons about the fragility of safety and the importance of trusting my instincts. The calls had started as a vague unease, a whisper in the dark, and spiraled into a tangible threat that invaded every corner of my existence. I realized how easy it is to dismiss warning signs, to hope the worst won't come true, only to find that danger often lurks in the shadows just beyond perception. The experience forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that safety is never guaranteed. It's a delicate balance, maintained through awareness, caution, and connection. The thin line between security and vulnerability can shift in an instant, and sometimes, the most insidious threats are the ones you never see coming. I began taking steps to fortify my life, upgrading security systems, setting boundaries with technology, and learning self-defense. But more importantly, I committed to staying connected, refusing to let fear isolate me. I understood now that strength comes not just from physical safeguards but from the community around me and the willingness to face darkness with open eyes. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, the relentless calls, the haunting presence at the cabin, Greg's confessions, and the tangled web of past secrets, I recognized a deeper lesson about trust and fear. The threats had come from unexpected places, from familiar faces and hidden histories. The scars left behind were not only physical but psychological, a reminder that danger often wears a mask that can fool even the most vigilant. Despite everything, I emerged with a cautious optimism. The nightmare had tested me, pushed me to the edge, but it hadn't broken me. Each step forward was a reclaiming of power, a refusal to be defined by fear. I learned to listen, to my instincts, to the people who cared, and to the subtle signals that warn of impending danger. As I moved forward, I carried with me the hard-earned knowledge that vigilance is a continuous practice, that safety is a shared responsibility, and that courage is found not in the absence of fear but in the resolve to confront it. The shadows may never fully disappear, but I am no longer afraid to face them. And so, with the support of friends, the guidance of the police, and a renewed sense of self, I stepped back into the world, alert, aware, and empowered, ready to meet whatever challenges lay ahead.